Welcome to our second podcast on the pharyngeal apparatus, the development of the face, head, and the neck region. We're going to pick up where we left off, and we're going to talk about the development of the salivary glands, and then we'll rapidly move into talking about the development of facial structures. So around 6 to 7 weeks of development, we are going to begin to form our salivary glands. Now, these are going to be epithelial buds from the oral cavity. So many of these are going to be endodermal in derivative. They're going to grow into our underlying mesenchyme. And remember, this is going to consist of our original somatic mesoderm as well as neural crest cells that have been migrating into this particular area. Now, the parotid gland is going to be the largest of our salivary glands, and it is the first to form. This one is going to form from the oral ectoderm. This is going to be lining the margins of the stomadeum. And then as this begins to form in this area, you're going to have relative migration of this tissue back from the opening of the mouth toward the temporal part, toward the ears. And as this relative migration occurs, you're going to leave a duct. And this is going to be Stenson's duct that connects the parotid gland with the opening in the oral cavity, and that's going to be just underneath the tongue on either side of the frenulum of the tongue. Now, the submandibular gland, this is going to form again in the floor of the stomadeum, and these are not ectodermal, these are endodermal in origin, and these are going to be just lateral to the tongue. The sublingual is going to start with multiple endodermal origins, and these are going to grow from the paralingual sulcus. This is going to be a groove sort of lateral to the tongue. And these are going to be the last two that form. They're going to form on either side. They're paired. And 2 weeks, they're going to form 2 weeks after the other gland. So parotid is first, followed by submandibular, then sublingual gland from the tissue that lines the mouth and stomadeum. Now we're going to finish off looking at the development of the face. This is a quite complex task. We're starting essentially with a blank, plain sheet of paper. It is just plain. And we're going to develop all of our very distinctive facial structures from various organizing centers. These are inductive centers, and what we're going to see is that we have the prosencephalic center. Now, anytime we're talking about cephalic, we're talking about the brain. And in this case, we're talking about rostral to the notochord and ventral to the prosencephalon. The prosencephalon is a portion of the forebrain. We also have the rhomencephalic center, and this is going to be ventral to the rhomencephalon, which is the hindbrain. So these organizing centers, the prosencephalic and the rhomencephalic center, they are going to induce our 5 facial primordia to form in the right place at the right time. The first is our frontonasal prominence. As you can see pictured green here, this is going to be the bulk of our forehead and our nasal area. But we're also going to have a pair of maxillary prominences, right and left, and mandibular prominences, right and left. And we're going to see how they will grow together to form the mandible, major portions of the maxilla, and then that frontonasal prominence will occupy the upper part of the face. Now, as we've mentioned several times, we have the original somatic mesoderm. However, neural crest cells are going to be quite important in populating our craniofacial structures. And so neural crests are going to form cartilage, which will then be converted into bone in many cases and ligaments. So a lot of the connective tissue elements are going to be from neural crest cells. Now, myoblasts that we have in the area, they're going to come from our paraaxial mesoderm. So from some somites, and we'll talk about those as we get a little bit later, talking about skeletal development, and from our prechordal mesoderm. So all of our original mesoderm, this is going to give rise to our voluntary skeletal muscles that are present in the face. So as we look at the stomadeum, this is only going to be defined by these 5 primordia that are around it. If they weren't present, you wouldn't have a stomadeum. So the frontonasal prominence is the rostral boundary of the stomadeum. The maxillary prominence on either side is the lateral boundary. And the mandibular prominence is going to be the caudal boundary as it defines the mandible and is therefore going to essentially be the lower lip area. Now, facial development, again, starting at week 4, and usually by week 8, we have pretty much completed facial development. So this is a very critical period of development. We can see a lot of congenital anomalies that occur from various agents, teratogenic agents, whether they be environmental factors, drugs, or otherwise. Now, at the end of week 4, if we look on our frontonasal prominence on the lateral aspects, we're going to see thickenings of tissue. We have tissue undergoing a lot of mitotic activity, much more so than the surrounding tissue, so it's going to thicken into what we refer to as nasal placodes. These are going to be the primordia of our external nares, the nostrils, as well as the tissue of the nose itself and the nasal cavities that we will develop later. And so from these nasal placodes, what's going to happen is the central portion of these nasal placodes is going to regress. It's going to form into a nasal pit. And it's not so much that it is undergoing apoptotic activity, it's just the lateral tissue of the placode is going to be dividing much more rapidly, and it's going to form nasal prominences. And these are going to be horseshoe-shaped in nature. You can see the legs of the horseshoe, if you will, are coming together at the point of the stomadeum. And at that point, we're going to define this nasal prominence as having a median portion, which, as you can see, is facing towards the midline of the body. Here's our median portion of the nasal prominence, and a lateral portion of the nasal prominence. It's on the outside, and this is where the two arms of that horseshoe are going to come together. And as we mentioned, these prominences are primarily formed because of proliferation, not necessarily because of tissue undergoing apoptosis in the area of the nasal pit. So there we can see a little bit more closely our median and lateral nasal prominences. That's going to make up the boundary where we're going to define our external nares. And so as we look, that depression that's left behind, this is going to be the nasal pit. And this is the opening is going to be our nare, our external nare. And as we're going to see, this pit is going to continue to invaginate deeper and deeper and deeper. And this is going to be the beginnings of carving out our nasal cavities. Now, if we can look at this in cross section, what we would see, one more before we get to the cross section. As we've mentioned, we have our median and lateral nasal prominences. And as they come together at that point along the stomadeum, that's where we find the labial groove, the junction of those two. It's almost like the legs of the horseshoe coming together, and you'll find that labial groove. Often this is going to be an area where we will see clefting if we don't have enough neural crest cells. Now, let's look in cross-section at what's going on as we form our nasal area. Here we can see our nasal placode. We're cutting through this section right here and looking at it. So we see the thickenings in the area of the nasal placode. Now we're going to get the ridges, the prominences. They're going to start to form higher as the nasal pit begins to invaginate deeply into the tissue. So here we have a medial nasal prominence and our lateral nasal prominence as the nasal pit gets deeper and deeper into the tissue. At the end of week 5, we have basically reshaped our pharyngeal arches, and now we're going to begin to see our auricular hillocks. These are going to form, and the auricular hillocks are going to begin to form the pinna of the ear. That's going to be our external ear form as those auricular hillocks. Now, as we return to the facial development, we have the labial groove, and that is, again, between the median and lateral nasal prominences. But between where we see that lateral prominence and we see the maxillary prominence coming together, we're also going to have a groove. This cleft is called the nasolacrimal groove. And it's actually going to be this junction, this contact between the maxillary prominence and the nasal prominence on that lateral aspect that is going to drive those nasal structures closer and closer to the midline. The maxilla is going to be the engine that pushes those the nasal prominences closer and closer until they fuse along the midline. Those median nasal prominences are going to fuse into what we know as the bridge of the nose. Now, as we think about our face, we really don't see any major divisions in the adult human face, and really it's this nasolacrimal groove in the junction between the maxillary prominence and the lateral nasal prominence that really gives the continuity between the nose and the cheek of the face, and that's where you really will see that occurring. So the maxillary prominences are going to fuse together with the lateral nasal prominences, and now the maxillary prominences are going to begin to grow closer and closer as they push toward the midline, and because of this fusion with the nasal prominences, they are going to be pushed ahead of the maxillary prominences until they fuse together into our singular nose. So the medial prominences will fuse into the nose. The lateral prominences are going to be our nostrils on the lateral aspect of the nose. So here in week 7, we see that relative medial migration of the maxillary prominence and thus pushing the medial nasal prominences together. As they fuse together, portions of that medial nasal prominence are actually going to form what is referred to as the intermaxillary segment. Now, this intermaxillary segment is going to be important because it is going to give rise to the premaxillary part of the maxilla. The maxilla is not going to be one continuous bone. We're going to have a right and left maxilla with this premaxillary bone right in the middle. So that's going to come from our intermaxillary segment. We're also going to see that this gives rise to the philtrum of our lip, our upper lip, and the little indentation we have that runs up to the part of our nose. That little indentation is the philtrum. So that's going to come from the intermaxillary segment, as well as the primary palate, this hard first part of our palate just behind our teeth. That's going to come from this intermaxillary segment. So it's going to form an important part of the nose. It's going to close off the open front part of our maxilla, and it's going to begin to form the first part of our primary palate as part of the roof of our mouth. So here we can see much later in development, we can see the structures that are derived from the front and nasal prominence. You can see the center of our forehead and the bulk of our nose. The maxillary prominence, again, is contributing to the maxilla. The mandibular prominence is going to be the mandible. Now, I wish that they had extended the green front and nasal prominence. I wish they would have extended it down a little bit to be the philtrum, because that is, in fact, from the front and nasal prominence. It's going to be from the medial nasal prominences, so you need a little strip of green. And I think in our animation that we'll see in just a bit, I believe that animation is going to show that coming down as well. Now, if we could look in cross-section, it's what's happening with the roof of the mouth as this is occurring. Now let's watch an animation that's going to put all of this into motion as we see the relative movement and growth that happens in the formation of the face. here we have our labial groove. We have our nasolacrimal groove on the outside. Here's our medial and lateral nasal prominences, the maxillary prominence pushing. And as we push it together, here we see our two nasal pits. Here we see this, they're calling this front and nasal prominence. This is just this tissue between. And then we have our medial nasal prominences bordered here. Well, as the maxilla is growing closer and closer to the midline, our medial nasal prominences continue to get closer and closer together. Closer and closer together. Now we have our inner maxillary segment. They fuse together into one piece. Here we have the philtrum of the lip. This is going to give rise to the bony structure, the premaxillary part of our jaw. That's going to close that part off. And then we have the primary palate as we're going to start growing our hard palate that's going to separate our oral cavity from our nasal cavity above. So the maxillary prominence gives rise to lateral parts of the upper lip, most of the maxilla, the secondary palate, and the upper cheek region, which we'll describe as we move a little bit further in facial development. And the mandibular prominence is going to give rise to your chin, your lower lip, lower cheek regions, but certainly the mandible and your lower jaw. So as we return to nasal development, here we can see, as we've seen in previous slides, we have our thickenings, the nasal placode, the nasal pit that continues to invaginate deeper and deeper into the mesenchymal tissue. And then finally, as we overgrow our lateral nasal prominence, then we're going to create this small opening that's going to be the nares or the nostril, and we're going to create the nasal sac beneath this tissue. Again, this is going to be the beginnings of our formation of our nasal cavity, which we're going to develop much more deeply. But before we get into looking at the nasal cavity, let's watch a video of the formation of the nasal pits and the nasal sacs. So extending our nasal sac tissue deeper into our underlying mesenchyme. Here I think you can see we've cut this in a sagittal section now as opposed to a transverse section that we were looking at previously. And we can see we're beginning to form our primary palate. Here's our stomaneum and oral cavity. And our nasal sac continues to get deeper and deeper into this mesenchymal tissue. Here is our forebrain area just above. And so as this tissue begins to grow, we've got ectodermal tissue that is being pulled in. We have endodermal tissue lining the inside of the oral cavity in yellow. And then we also have some of this ectodermal tissue just around the region of the lip and the beginning of the roof of the mouth here. And it's going to be in this place where we have no mesodermal tissue separating the ectoderm and the oral cavity and ectoderm in our nasal sac that we have the oronasal membrane. Don't confuse this with oropharyngeal. That was earlier for the mouth. This is the oral nasal membrane that separates the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. Now this is going to continue to grow, and this is going to deepen and expand the nasal cavity. Certainly our oral cavity is growing. And so by about the 6th week, what's going to happen, this membrane has become so thin that this membrane is actually going to rupture. And when this membrane ruptures, we're going to have one large common cavity. And so this one large common cavity is going to be what's referred to as the primordial choana. And this choana is going to be our nasal cavity plus the pharynx. And so it's going to be all joined together. So here we can see that we've lost the oronasal membrane. We haven't begun to form our palate yet, the roof of the mouth. So we have this continuity between the oral cavity, the nasal cavity, and it really is the beginnings of the pharyngeal region. And what's going to separate now the nasal from the oral region is the growing of our primary and our secondary palate that is going to form the roof of the mouth and the floor then of our nasal cavity. So as we look at this primary choana, what we're going to see is we've got ectoderm along the roof of the nasal cavity, and this is going to develop into our olfactory epithelium. Now, this is going to include our olfactory receptor cells, whose axons then make up our olfactory nerves. These are going to form synapses with other neurons in the olfactory tract that will send information on to the brain. So we can see by much later in development, we have our olfactory bulb. We've got our olfactory nerves stemming from our olfactory epithelium. We've now got our nasal cavity. And instead of a choana, what we've got is we have these folds or ridges that we see. It's going to increase the surface area in the nasal cavity, and these are our nasal conchae, the folds that we see here. There's our palate. Now we have our existing choana, and the choana is going to essentially be the pharynx, that junction between the nasal cavity and our oral cavity. And so we have our pharynx proper. We have our nasopharynx, which some may refer to that as the choana. And here we have our oropharynx. Here's a video showing this view of nasal cavity development. Now, as we finish off our discussion of the pharyngeal apparatus, the last thing to speak of is the development of our palate, that ridge of tissue that is going to divide the oral cavity from the nasal cavity. We're going to see that it's a composite structure, and it's going to develop from two primordial tissue types. The primary palate, which we saw form from our intermaxillary segment, is going to contribute to the front portion of our palate, but then the secondary palate is going to be our other primordia that we're going to be working with here. Now, palatogenesis, this is going to begin at the end of the 5th week, as again we form the intermaxillary segment, form that primary palate. And the 6th through the 9th week, these are going to be the critical stages for this, and certainly these are highly susceptible to teratogenic agents that can cause major problems, including cleft lip and cleft palate. So the primary palate, again, this is going to be from our median palatine processes that fuse together into the intermaxillary segment. Here we're looking at the roof of the mouth. We're seeing the maxilla, much of the bone that we see. This is going to be the hard palate that we're talking about. And then here we have the premaxillary part of the upper jaw. And so this premaxillary bone, that's going to come from the intermaxillary segment, and that's going to be the first beginnings then of our primary palate. Now, as we look at we're in, let's say for instance in this case, we are in the oral cavity and we're looking up at the nasal cavity because we have lost our oronasal membrane. So here we're developing our intermaxillary segment. These are the median palatine processes. No, we've got our intermaxillary segment in place. And so what we're going to be working with now is we've got our nasal septum that is growing down from the nasal cavity, and we have this structure, this median palatine process that is forming from that intermaxillary segment as well. This is going to form the primary palate from the intermaxillary segment, and we're also going to have lateral palatine processes that are going to be growing in from the edges. So all of these are going to contribute together to form our palate. And we've already said here the primary palate is going to form that premaxillary part of the maxilla. Okay, so the secondary palate, this is going to be the structure with everything except this very frontal portion here from the median palatine process. The secondary palate is going to be the primordia for the remainder of the hard and the soft parts of the palate, and we kind of refer to these as the posterior palate. And so the incisive fossa, That is going to be here in the very midline, and we saw that in the previous skeletal illustration of the adult jaw. And so that's going to be relative to this very front part here. And so this would be anterior, and all of this posterior is going to be derived as the secondary palate. Now, in addition to looking upwards from the floor of the oral cavity, if we take a coronal section and we look at that coronal cut, now we're basically looking at someone's head face on, but the face has been removed. And so we've got the oral cavity, we've got the tongue forming in the floor of the oral cavity, we've got the nasal septum that is growing downward from the roof of the nasal cavity, and then we have our lateral palatine processes growing in. Now notice they seem to be growing downward. That's because at this point the tongue takes up much more room in the oral cavity than anything else. Later in development, as the oral cavity expands, as the tongue becomes a relatively smaller component, these lateral palatine processes will snap up into a shelf. So these lateral palatine processes, we can see them here. We can see them in both sections. These are mesenchymal projections. They're mesodermal tissues growing in from our maxillary prominences on the lateral aspect, not from the intermaxillary segment, but from the maxillary prominences proper. So they're growing together here, and a little bit later in development, we can see we've got a much larger oral cavity. The tongue is much smaller relative to the overall shape and is much lower, so the tongue is out of the way, and our lateral palatine processes are growing closer and closer to the midline to form the definitive secondary palate. But we can also see that the nasal septum is growing downward, and it will contact the lateral palatine processes at the midline and fuse with them. And in the midline of these palatine processes, we're going to have the palatine raphe. It's going to be a line and a ridge of tissue right down the midline of our secondary palate. And if you run your tongue along the roof of the mouth, you will feel that ridge, the palatine raphe, running right along the midline. That's from the fusion of your lateral palatine processes and your fusion with the downward growing nasal septum. Now, as we first form our mesenchymal tissue, we are going to ossify that tissue. It's going to form bone. And this is going to be from our intramembranous type of ossification. We're not going to start with a cartilaginous template. So we're going to form ossification from existing mesenchymal cells, and that's going to grow into our hard palate. Now, the hard palate is going to be comprised of the primary palate and the secondary palate. But in the very back where ossification does not occur, that's going to be our soft palate. And extending from the soft palate, we're going to have this extension of the soft palate hanging down, which often yields a very potent gag reflex. And that structure that dangles from the roof of the mouth and part of the soft palate is called the uvula. That will end our discussion of the pharyngeal apparatus, and we're going to finish off with an animation showing the development of the palate.